main thing I'd like to get to today, however, is the beginning of the story of the Scottish Reformation. So we've looked at Germany, we've looked at Switzerland, we've looked at England now, and of course for us as Presbyterians, we're especially interested in Scotland because that's where, strictly speaking, the Presbyterian Church really got going under John Knox. And we in many ways trace not only our Presbyterian heritage, but more than we probably suspect, our American heritage back to what happened in Scotland, and it got its start under John Knox. And so it's John Knox that's going to occupy our attention at least later in our conversation today. We won't get through him. That's the trade-off. John Knox was educated originally to be a priest, which in Scotland at the time was the best way to achieve a certain degree of advancement. And so his studies for the priesthood exposed him to a lot of the theology of the church, but not so much of the Bible. And as we've seen before, the similar kind of experience with William Tyndale and others who really felt that there was something behind the curtain that they just weren't being able to access. And that's the original source of all of this. And Knox had a similar kind of experience. His limited reading of the Scriptures did, however, cause him to fixate especially on one text, and that's the text that I'd like to read for you this morning. And it's the high priestly prayer of Jesus from John chapter 17. This was probably in terms of a biblical inspiration behind John Knox, this was what his mind kept going back to as he read this text and as he reflected on its meaning and compared his experience of the church in Scotland at the time with his reading of the New Testament. This was the text that seemed to be always concerning him. So I'm going to try reading it from the King James, and we'll see how we do. But this is, we're going to start in John chapter 17, beginning at verse 4, and I'll read about as long as I want to. So here we are. Beginning in verse 4, John 17, this is the word of God. I have glorified thee on earth. I have finished the work which you gave me to do. And now, O Father, glorify me with your own self, with the glory that I had with you before the world was. I've manifested your name unto the men whom you gave me out of the world. They were yours, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Now they have known that all the things whatever you gave me have been given to them. For I have given unto them the words which you gave me, and they have received them, and have known surely that I came from you, and they have believed that you sent me. I pray for them. I pray not for the world, but for those whom you gave me. They are yours, and all of mine are yours, and theirs, and they are mine, and I am glorified in them. And now I am no more in the world, but these are in the world, and I come to you, Holy Father. Keep through your own name those whom you have given me, that they may be one as we are. Thank you. And the line in that text that kept striking John Knox was that statement, I pray for them, I don't pray for the world. And the entire text, which makes a sharp distinction between the people who belong to Christ and the people who, in a sense, belong to this world, was a steady concern to Knox, because in his experience in Scotland at the time, it seemed to him that the church belonged to the world. And he wondered what exactly was this church that Christ was describing that seemed to stand in such sharp distinction from the world. And in many ways, his career eventually became an attempt to try to recreate a church in which there was a clear distinction between this world and the people of God. So we'll see a little bit of that as we go along today, but let's have a word of prayer and we'll get started. Father, we're grateful for your mercies to us. We thank you that you have once again in your grace given us this rich and wonderful privilege of gathering together with your people. We thank you for the story of the heroes and heroines of history who have paved the way into a world which has now given us an opportunity to gather together in this way. We pray that we would be faithful as they have been to prepare the way for generations to come. And we pray that in all of this, Christ would be honored, and we ask these things in His name. Amen. All right, well, let's talk about Elizabeth a little bit. We've been looking at Tudor England. This is usually called part of Tudor-Stuart England. Tudors, of course, begin with Henry VII. We've looked at his career. We looked at Henry VIII, and of course, Edward, who had the effect of dragging, though he was young, he was committed personally, even as a young teenager, and certainly those who were close to him were committed to moving England in the direction of the Protestant Reformation as it was expressing itself in Germany, but especially in Switzerland. Then you have, of course, after his death at a fairly young age as a teenager, his half-sister Mary, who is equally committed to taking England back into the arms of the Pope. And so the English people are being whipsawed here back and forth, and it was creating a pretty significant amount of tumultuous confusion, I would say, generally through the culture, because on one hand, the things that were being esteemed were on the next hand being things that were condemned. And it all brought a rather complicated circumstance into the lap, as it were, of Elizabeth, who was, of course, the third now sibling of these other two and the daughter of Henry VIII and of Anne Boleyn, the last surviving of this family. And she is the Virgin Queen. She never had any children. And so the state of Virginia named for her, of course, but more importantly, this is the end of the Tudor dynasty. And from this point on, it's going to be the Stuarts who will come down from Scotland and take over rule in England. So Elizabeth takes the throne in 1558. And as I say, probably the most thorny problem that was confronting her at the beginning was which way you're going to go. The English people, of course, are in a state of high turmoil now. They've had this hard Catholic kind of monarch who succeeded a hard Protestant kind of monarch. Henry VIII is his own sort of person, and the people of England at this point are all sort of living in this expectation of wondering what's going to happen. Obviously, the very committed Catholics in England were hoping that Elizabeth would follow suit with her predecessor and keep England on the path to Roman Catholicism. It didn't happen that way. The people who were on the right, I won't say right and left like politically, but I'm just saying on the two ends of the spectrum here, mostly Calvinistic types, were hoping that Elizabeth was going to follow the lead of Edward earlier and go more toward the Reformation. She didn't do that either. So what she gave us was called the Elizabethan settlement. It was politically astute. It probably brought the majority of English people into a kind of big tent, if you will, but it left on each end these who were not pleased with the outcome. So it was a church that was nominally Protestant. That was the name on the door, Protestant, but substantially Catholic. The culture, the theology, the feel, the texture of the church was more Catholic than Protestant. And I think it's safe to say that probably for the average English person, this was fine. This would cover their concerns. But of course, these on the fringe were much less pleased with this. The Catholic side, of course, was unhappy with this, and they were beginning to do everything they could to try to influence in a kind of underground fashion a renewal of the Catholic faith in England. On the other hand, these Protestants who had largely been in exile in Reformation countries in England, especially in Geneva, Frankfurt, and other places, began to filter back into England, happy to hear that England was now officially Protestant, but the first time they went to church, they weren't so happy with the experience they had. And so they set about a process of trying to, as they viewed it, purify the Anglican Church, which had been created then as part of the Elizabethan settlement. This earned for them the pejorative title Puritan, the puritanical ones, you see. These who are trying to purify the church, and that term stuck. And as you know, to this day, we think of the Puritans as these people who originally in England were attempting to bring about that sort of reform in the direction of the Reformation on the continent. The beginning of this process was subtle, but many of these people who were coming from the continent were really holding posts that were fairly influential in England, academic posts and so on. And so they had kind of a disproportionate influence. Even though they were relatively few in number, they did have an exaggerated impact. And all through Elizabethan England, you have this sort of delicate dance that was carried on. Elizabeth was a master political tactician. She didn't make these people angry, but she didn't quite give them what they wanted. And all through the 50 years or so that she reigned, it was a very interesting kind of balancing act that she carried on with these who were somewhat influential, and yet at the same time she was able to hold her own. Later monarchs, James I certainly, and especially Charles I, who came later in the early 17th century, didn't have quite the same subtlety and provoked quite a bit more of a crisis, culminating in what's called the Puritan Revolution, which begins about 1642. Now that's way ahead of our story, but the story begins here. And so it's these folks coming back now from the continent after the reign of Mary Tudor who are beginning this process that becomes what we call the history of Puritanism in England. Pope Pius V attempted at the beginning to woo Elizabeth back to the Roman Catholic fold. She wasn't willing to budge. Finally, he got frustrated and he excommunicated her in 1570, so that more or less burned any bridges there. I just want to mention briefly Scotland. Obviously, we're going to talk about Scotland in much greater detail just a little bit later and ongoing, but just a couple of things that touch on the career of Elizabeth. Mary, Queen of Scots, who we're going to look at separately, came back to Scotland in 1560. She had been in France since she was 5 years old. She was the daughter of James V and Mary Guise, French princess, and she had been reared in the Roman Catholic world of France and also in the very kind of opulent world of French royalty. And when she married the Dauphin of France, who was Francis II, it was expected she would remain in France as his wife and queen, but he died almost immediately, within a year or so. And at the very moment that that happened, Scotland was erupting in a kind of civil war between the Catholic forces on the one hand, championed by Mary Guise, the regent in Scotland, and the rising Protestant forces that were being represented by John Knox. So it was a very complicated moment. Mary, Queen of Scots, didn't want to go home. She liked France. She didn't like Scotland so much. Scotland was kind of a backwater. Even though she was from Scotland, she preferred to stay in France, but huge pressure was put on her to return home. And she did in 1560. And that gives rise to one of the most interesting chapters in church history, and we want to look at this separately, and that's this relationship between John Knox on the one hand, the fiery preacher, and Mary, Queen of Scots on the other, this young, pretty, kind of charming queen in Scotland. Mary, Queen of Scots, I think it's safe to say, lost that conflict and finally abdicated the throne in 1568, fleeing to England, where she was protected by Elizabeth until 1583, when it became clear that Mary, Queen of Scots, was actually in on a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth. And had Elizabeth died, Mary, Queen of Scots, actually, by the complicated family relationships of the day, would have been the heir to the throne in England. So if that had worked, you see, that would have been a very interesting change of events. Well, when Elizabeth had good hard evidence that Mary had been involved in that sort of conspiracy for Elizabeth's own assassination. That was it. And so poor Mary, Queen of Scots, lost her head, as they say. Spain is the other little piece of the puzzle I just want to mention here. You recall that Philip II was married to Mary Tudor. No children from that relationship, and Philip was only in England for about a year or so, and then he went home. He was the King of Spain, and he spent the rest of his time in Spain. And so Mary Tudor, the wife of Philip, is there nevertheless with an AWOL husband. And of course, we've talked about her career last time. Well, as soon as Mary died and left Philip a widower, Elizabeth came to the throne, and Philip, thinking, well, you know, debonair guy that I am, he throws out the bid there to Elizabeth. Would you like to get married? You know, Elizabeth wasn't about to marry Philip II. I don't think there was any chance that that would happen. She knew the political fallout of that would be astronomical, nor did she want to marry him anyway, you know. So she pretty much planted her heels at that point and said there was no way she was going to align England with Catholic Spain, the Catholic world, and more or less undo much of what she was trying to achieve in terms of her own policies in England. So she declined that, and so Philip was jilted at that point. And to make matters worse, of course, throughout the reign of Elizabeth, Elizabeth's favorite privateer, a guy by the name of Francis Drake, loved to sail the seas and harass the Spanish. And so he was creating all kinds of difficulties for Spain until finally it culminated in 1587 and 88 with one of the most famous incidents you're familiar with, of course, the Spanish Armada. Close advisors to Philip told him, this is a bad idea. This ain't going to fly, you know. But Philip, a strong Catholic, believed it was a religiously motivated war. He believed that they would win this war because God was on their side, and that the net effect of it would be to bring England back into the Catholic fold. So this campaign, this armada, was in many ways, as best as we can tell, from Philip's point of view, a sincerely driven religious campaign. He wanted to win England back, if not by romance, then by war, you see. And so that was what set this awesome armada off. But of course, as it turns out, not only were the English mariners superior with their lighter, more maneuverable ships, but the weather didn't help them either, and the whole thing turned out to be a colossal catastrophe. And it was a very significant moment. Up until this time, Spain was still the wealthiest and at least ostensibly most powerful nation in the family of nations in Europe. With the loss of the Armada, it was a colossal reversal of fortunes, and that was the beginning of a process whereby Spain more or less descended to a third-rate power. Didn't happen immediately, but pretty quickly. And England, on the other hand, had this sort of equally in reverse experience of being pushed into a prominent position. This is really the beginning of the rise of what eventually became the great sort of colonial English power that spread around the world. It really sort of started at this point with the defeat of the Armada. So this is quite a turning point. It's interesting from our point of view that it has this religious theme that really explains, at least to some degree, what was going on. A couple of the things just in passing here. Of course, Elizabeth, as is true of many female monarchs, prefers trading to raiding. And so even though Francis Drake was out doing a fair amount of raiding, for which Elizabeth maintained sort of plausible deniability, but she was constantly encouraging him to do it, you know, sort of on the side. Nevertheless, her official policy was to build good, strong, robust trading relationships with her European partners. And that did begin to create a certain degree of wealth in the middle class in England. It didn't happen overnight, but it did gradually begin to take place. And this is part of what increases the relative wealth of England over time and begins to diminish the wealth of other countries that weren't using this, and I'm telling you, as I've told you before, really born out of the Reformation, this kind of free enterprise mentality, this kind of Protestant work ethic with innovation, with that kind of high productive view of labor and so on. It really did begin to touch England especially, and we begin to see a change. We think of Shakespeare, of course, Elizabethan England. We think of a growing middle class. All of this would be interesting, separate, but beyond the scope of our concern. So, there's Elizabeth. I feel so much better. I just got that off my chest. Okay. Now we're going to move straight north to Scotland and the Reformation. Some of you, I assume, may have come across or read this wonderful little book, New York Times bestseller from a few years back, How the Scots Invented the Modern World. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. I don't embrace or endorse everything this fellow says, but in the main, I think he's right on the money. That we owe so much to Scotland, so much more possibly than we can imagine, and beyond that, we owe it really to the original genius of John Knox, who would himself frankly acknowledge it was the genius of John Calvin, who imprinted upon Knox this design, not simply for church, but for state, and Knox attempted his very best to implement it in Scotland, and at least at the time failed. But the seeds were planted so that by 30 years after John Knox was out of the picture, Scotland had more or less embraced virtually everything he had argued for. He just couldn't make it happen that fast. And so John Knox is really quite a remarkable visionary. And in many ways, our whole idea of government of the people, by the people, for the people, that sort of idea that the people are the final repository of authority is, for the first time in history, really attempted in Scotland in this John Knox sort of driven vision for the way that government should be run. And this thesis is developed, I think, quite effectively in this book, and so if you ever want to take a look at that more closely, then I certainly recommend it. Early in his book, he makes this comment about Knox, the author, who is Arthur Herman. This comment, quote, "Like Luther, Knox left an indelible mark on his national culture. Uncompromising, dogmatic, and driven, John Knox was a prolific writer and a preacher of truly terrifying power. His early years as a Protestant firebrand had been spent in exile, imprisonment, and even penal servitude, chained to a rowing bench in the king's galleys, the French king, by the way. The harsh trials toughened him physically and spiritually for what was to come. He became John Knox, quote, he who feared no man." A little flavor of this fellow. We'll look at his career in more detail next time we're together. I'm just kind of giving you a snippet, a teaser here, if you will, but I'm hoping it'll cause you to want to pursue more thinking about him. But the conflict that developed between Knox on the one hand and Mary, Queen of Scots, on the other. Mary was sort of the, what would you say, she was like this, I don't know what term to use exactly. The nobility in Scotland loved her because she was cute. Can I put it that way? She was kind of happy and had this wonderful little French accent, and she would throw big parties in the palace, and she really did sort of seduce, if you got my drift here, just the nobility. They loved to go to the court of Mary, Queen of Scots, and enjoy the lovely surroundings because she brought all of that kind of French culture back to Scotland. And it seemed as if all was lost. John Knox bought none of it. And just a couple of blocks away, he was preaching the most fiery sermons. And the sermons were powerful, and they shook the country. They shook it to its core. More than once, John Knox reduced Mary, Queen of Scots, to tears in his campaign against her, you see. She famously made a comment on one occasion, quote, "I fear the preaching and prayers of John Knox more than any army or navy the world might launch." This is the power of a preacher. We think history is mapped out by bazookas and bombs and armaments. And let me tell you something. There is another story. There's another agenda going on in history, and it is the power of the Word of God. And I want to highlight that a little bit more next time. I just want to plant the seed that John Knox is one of many examples of people who have fundamentally altered the course of history, not because they had any armament in their hand, but because they had the sword that comes out of the mouth of the rider on the horse, the sword that became this powerful force for altering the way people saw politics, saw religion, saw everything in their lives. So John Knox is an incredible character, and we as Presbyterians should look back on him in the best sense of the word with a fair amount of pride. This is the man God used. He wasn't perfect by any means, but he was the man God used to start something that was truly an innovation in the history of the church, as well as in the history, really, of political theory itself. All right. Well, if we're going to talk about Scotland, let's talk about Scotland. And so this is just the quickest thumbnail sketch of a little bit of the story of Scotland, just for fun here, you know. But when we think about Scotland, we think about that region that was more or less created by the creation of Hadrian's Wall back in 120 AD or thereabouts. Hadrian, the Roman emperor, of course, following from the conquest of England by Claudius some 70 years earlier, demarcates the northern boundary, and usually it's put at Hadrian's Wall. There's a further boundary north called the Antonine Wall, but usually it's Hadrian's Wall that is roughly defining of the region that separates England from Scotland, and you can go visit it today, and it's kind of fun. When the Romans were there, they of course looked north. They looked into that region of Scotland and thought to themselves, maybe we should go up there and conquer it, but the people were pretty scary. And so the Romans thought, you know, enough is enough. We've got plenty of England here, and I don't know, those folks look kind of odd. And so they called them the Picts, P-I-C-T-S, which means the painted people. And that was these folks out there in Scotland. They were quite a crew to deal with. Well, even though the Romans left them alone, they themselves were engaged in ongoing tribal conflicts between tribal chieftains and so on in that region for a good long time. There were Christian missionaries who went in and tried to reach these, as they weren't called Scottish then, but these people. St. Ninian is probably one of the most famous early ones, 432, who goes in and preaches the gospel with some degree of success. After the effects of St. Patrick in Ireland, other missionaries came from Ireland into Scotland, and they arrived around 480 and thereafter, speaking Gaelic, and the Roman word for Gaelic was Scoti, and so that's where the name Scotland came from. So it was kind of this mixture of Irish, Scottish influence there. This sort of internal warfare among all of these tribal groups in Scotland continued until finally in about 843, a character came along who was able to, at least in a broad sense, sort of unite the Scottish. I don't want to overstate this because it wasn't exactly a unified control, but in 843, the House of Alpin is formed, and there is at least some degree of consolidation now under one leader, although, as I say, it was still pretty tumultuous within. The Wars of Independence with William Wallace, he died in 1305, really did establish more or less a sense of the Scottish independence from England, and the Scottish identity in some way is really created at that point. William Wallace, of course, died. You know that story, Braveheart and all of that. But the guy that took over, galvanized really Scottish control following him, was a man named Robert the Bruce, you know. He didn't have any sons, but he had a daughter named Margaret, and she married a nobleman in Scotland whose last name was Stuart, and the two of them had a son, and that son established then the House of Stuart. And so Stuart Scotland continues almost from the time of William Wallace on, right down to the era in which we are interested in. Now, I'm skipping over all of the Stuart rulers until we get to this time that we're interested in, which is just as we're turning now into the 16th century. The 16th century, the century of Reformation. What's happening in Scotland? Well, the guy that's ruling is James Stuart IV. Scotland and the Catholic Church by this time are both in dire need of reform. It may have been true all along, but certainly by this point, we've looked in detail already at the state of the Catholic Church. This was really, in most Catholic historians readily grant this. This was really about as low as Catholic leadership sunk, during these years, and it was true throughout the Catholic world, including Scotland. Kenneth Scott Latourette, who's probably, I would say, maybe one of the most respected church historians of the 20th century, describing Scotland, does it in these words, quote, "Lawlessness was rife, the nobility were turbulent, unwilling to submit to royal authority, and divided into warring factions. Some episcopal sees were vacant. Where they were filled, their incumbents were embroiled in the political strife of the realm. And many ecclesiastical posts were given to sons of the nobles who enjoyed the revenues, but absentees did not perform the associated duties. The country was torn between those who wished closer relationships with the hereditary foe, the English, and those who stood for the traditional anti-English tie with France. Scotland is sort of caught in the middle between these two forces, France and England, and walking a bit of a tightrope between them, and at the same time facing all kinds of internal conflict, as is described here by Latourette. About half of Scotland's wealth at this time belonged to the church. If you wanted to get along, if you wanted to advance politically, it meant virtually certainly you had to be some sort of ecclesiastical official. Priesthood was considered a step to political power, and that was the principal reason that people went into the priesthood, not for purposes of Christian ministry or just any such thing, but really because it was just the way that you could develop a career in Scotland at the time, and that was pretty much a given, understood throughout the realm. Of course, you know that historically, when that kind of situation arrives, then good people tend to withdraw, you see. And power defaults to the corrupt. And so Scotland was really in the throes of very corrupt leadership. Our friend James IV here was actually probably one of the better monarchs. He was a fairly competent ruler, and he was very impressed with the Renaissance, which was happening at this very moment. And he was trying as best he could to implement some of what he thought were the great advances that reflected the achievements of the Renaissance. You can tell that he's really alive right in the midst of the high Renaissance in Italy. Scotland is not the center of the Renaissance by any means, but he's aware of it, and he's wanting to make it part of his agenda as a ruler there in Scotland. Well, James tries to figure out a way to chart a course between these two lions, France on the one hand, England on the other. Remember, England and France in the late 1400s have just come through the 100 Years' War. We talked about Joan of Arc a few weeks ago and all of that. And so both sides are licking their wounds a little bit, but England a little bit more than France after that bloodbath of a 100 Years' War. And they're still not liking each other very much. And Scotland is strategic because, on the one hand, Scotland, if it allies with the French, it gives the French a sort of back door to England through Scotland. But at the same time, if it allies with England, then it is exposed to French attack. And so James here was feeling this kind of delicate problem, and so he makes a treaty with both, His treaty with France was called the Old Alliance, A-U-L-D, Old Alliance. His treaty with England was a treaty based on marriage in which he married the older sister of Henry VIII, Margaret. And so Margaret and James are married, and that cements, at least to some degree, his connection with England. At the same time, he has a deal with the French. This is Margaret. 10 years after he married Margaret, he died in the Battle of Flodden. The Battle of Flodden was exactly the worst thing that could have happened for a man who was trapped between these two treaties. Because in 1513, Henry had decided to launch a new war against France. And he's fighting somewhat effectively on French soil, and the French cash in their credit under the Old Alliance and say, okay, James, you promised to help us out. Now's the time. We want you to attack England from the north and divert some of the military hardware away from France because he'll have to defend on the northern frontier of England, which is what James does to honor that treaty, in spite of course, the protests of his wife. The battle is called the Battle of Flodden, and at that point James IV died. So that was the end of James IV. And it brought then his son, fairly young man at this point, James V, who now is the nephew of Henry VIII. And it was just about the time that he became king that John Knox was born. So just to try to keep our dots connected here, John Knox comes into the picture around 1510. We don't know the exact date. You know, we know when he died. We don't know quite so much when he... Some people would say it's as early as 1505. Some would say it's as late as 1515. So I'm just, splitting the difference. We're going to call it about 1510. Notice that this would be about the time that John Calvin was born. So they were about the same age. All right, who is John Knox? John Knox was born on a farm on the coast of Scotland that was openly exposed to French raiders. And so he grew up constantly facing the kind of threat that would come from the sea. He was a very bright student, and his father, believing that a better life could be created through this brilliant young son, spent a fair amount of money. This is a story we've heard before, similar to Martin Luther. Spent a fair amount of money having John Knox educated, and the expectation was that if he was given this education, he would be prepared to go into the priesthood, which, as I said earlier, would be a key, as it were, to political and economic advancement, and would not only improve the status of John Knox, but improve the status of the entire family. And so Knox had a tumultuous childhood, but at the same time was given a quite decent education in the process, and that was his background. He went through the entire academic process. He did very well, was a splendid student, never took a degree. And the reason he didn't take a degree was because you paid more for the degree than you did for the education. And so it wasn't uncommon for people to go through the entire educational process and then never, get their diploma. And in Scotland at the time, the way of accommodating that was to call that person Sir. So you'll often hear John Knox called Sir John Knox. But it is not to be construed as meaning he was born into Scottish nobility. He wasn't. He was born into a peasant family. But anyone who finished the academic process would get that title of honor, Sir. And so John Knox is often called Sir John Knox for that reason. During his educational process, as I mentioned earlier, he was fascinated with the story of the church, and especially how the church had come to be exactly what it was. He was confronted with a church in Scotland that was fully politicized, in which the clergy in the church had much less interest in the spiritual welfare of their parishioners than they did in the political machinations of Scotland vis-a-vis the rest of the community of nations in Europe at that time. And John Knox himself was aware that that didn't quite make sense to him. It did seem to him that the church should be about other things. And I mentioned to you earlier this fascination with John 17. He read it, reread it. I'm sure he did memorize it, Herm. And, he had it in the back of his mind, and he was quite aware that there was this significant difference between the vision of God's people there and anything that he was aware of in his experience as a person participating in the life of the church, even preparing for leadership in the church. And that does seem to have been a kind of a driving theme that carried him along for quite a ways. He was described as undistinguished in his appearance, eyebrows that slanted up, deep sockets, steel blue eyes with a ruddy complexion, and a beard of 1.5 hands that was not very full. I'm always amazed at how the great people in church history usually aren't very good looking, But anyway, John Knox made up for any lack of Hollywood looks by the power of his rhetoric. Anyway, as I say, he was born about 1510. We'll say a lot more about him at a later time. But 1528 was a rather strategic year. There was a man who was quite popular, a scholar in Scotland, whose name was Patrick Hamilton, and he was burned at the stake in 1528. Patrick Hamilton had gone to France and gotten an education, probably the finest school in the world at the time, would have been commonly viewed as that. And he was so he was a Scotsman there in France getting this education. And this was just about the time, we mentioned this when we were talking about John Calvin, when the Gospelers were sort of under the radar reading the writings of Martin Luther. Remember, Luther, really the Diet of Worms was 1521, so we're only just a few years into what you'd call the Reformation era. But the writings of Luther were spread throughout Europe. And even where they were illegal, as in France, nevertheless, there was a huge amount of interest in those writings, and a lot of people were reading them. And Patrick Hamilton was one of them who came across this movement and began to read the writings of Luther, and seems to have become deeply persuaded that Luther was onto something. And so he more or less imbibed this, and it had quite an influence on him. He returned to Scotland and took a prestigious post at St. Andrews, which was probably the most famous university in Scotland at the time, and was a very popular professor. Now, in class, he sort of towed the line, you know. He didn't say anything overly controversial in the classroom, but he did have a sort of informal gathering of interested students who would come to his home. And they would have a little kind of gabfest situation. They just sit around and talk about stuff. And this was off the record, this was informal, this was in his home. And at this point, he let his guard down quite a bit. And he would talk much more openly about Luther, about the Reformation, about his own views of it, and indeed his fairly strong bias in favor of it. The most powerful Roman Catholic in Scotland at the time was a man by the name of Cardinal Beaton, B-E-A-T-O-N. Cardinal Beaton got wind of this little private gathering that Patrick Hamilton was having and sent some spy students to attend this meeting. They came in just as if they were interested students, but they were actually taking names and so on, you know, about who was there. And they reported back to Cardinal Beaton, and in a kind of almost breathtaking act of I'll say a failure of due process. He had Patrick Hamilton arrested in the middle of the night, drug out of his bed, given about a 10-minute trial, burned at the stake, all within about, you know, an hour or two. So it was and it hit the Scottish people right at the core of their psyche, because this was a very well-known man, and he was a very highly respected scholar, and the private opinions that he held regarding the Reformation were believed to be part of what ought to be the interchange of ideas, etc. And to have this kind of travesty of justice take place was a powerful impact, including on John Knox himself. And this took place when John Knox was about 20 years old, maybe something like that. John Knox said later, not too much later, of this incident, "The reek of Master Hamilton's burning has infected as many as it blew upon." That's John Knox commenting on that. 10 years later, James V, he's about 30 years old now, marries Mary of Guise. In France at this time, there are three prominent noble families: Montmorency, Bourbon, and Bourbons, by the way, are generally Protestant, and the Guise family, which dominated. She's a princess of the Guise family. This does cement now a relationship between Scotland and France, and thus with the Catholic world. This is Mary. It was about this time that a fellow in Scotland named George Wishart fled. George Wishart is important for us because John Knox will eventually become his bodyguard, and that's why sometimes you see pictures of John Knox wearing a sword. So you get this interesting picture of John Knox, Sir John Knox with a sword, you see, and all of this kind of comes together. George Wishart was sympathetic to the Protestant Reformation, but he was unschooled. And he knew the marriage to Mary Guise was going to have a strong Catholic effect in the country, and he knew that he was indeed going to be in great peril, so he fled. And he actually, during the time that he was out of Scotland, got quite a respectable education in Reformation theology, and he would return later, and that would become part of the story of John Knox. So I'm mentioning it now just to tuck that in. Knox himself is serving at this point as a notary. He was serving as a tutor in a family that was more or less sympathetic to the Reformation as well. So while Knox was being a tutor, he was also being tutored in this family, and that was a shaping influence as well. All right. Mary, Queen of Scots, was born in 1542. She is the daughter of James V and Mary Guise. Her dad, James V, died 5 days later at the battle called the Battle of Solway Mass. This was a battle in which Henry VIII picked a fight with his nephew, James V, because James V was refusing to align himself with Henry now that Henry had broken from Rome. And James, of course, is put in this awkward position. He's just married Mary Guise, strong Catholic, and his uncle, Henry VIII, wants him to renounce the connection to the Pope. And so, even though they're uncle and nephew, they go to battle at Solway Mass 5 days after Mary, Queen of Scots, is born, and he dies in the battle. So, Mary, Queen of Scots, was the Queen of the Scots from the time she was 5 days old throughout the rest of her career. I'm going to leave the story there. I hope I'm leaving it at a point where you're just saying, oh no, we have to know more. Because there will be more, Lord willing, but we're going to save it for a later time. I'd like to return to this text and just use it as the basis for my brief Sunday school lesson this morning before we dismiss. This is the words of Jesus from that same text, John 17, beginning at verse 6. I've made your name known to those whom you gave me from the world. They are yours. You gave them to me. They have kept your word. Now they know that everything you've given me is from you. For the words that you gave me, I have given to them, and they have received them and know the truth that I came from you, and they believe that you sent me. I am asking on their behalf. I am not asking on behalf of the world. It's a remarkable statement in this high priestly prayer. But on behalf of those whom you gave me, because they are yours. We, of course, are God's people. There's an old saying, you've all heard it, we need to be in the world but not of it. And as you read the biblical description of what it is to live out a Christian life, you see that interesting balance. We do know that there are some Christian people who have gone to extremes in both directions. So we know that there are some who would say, you know, this world is so bad that the only really proper response to it is simply to escape into a safe place, build big walls, and keep the world out, and live in this kind of quiet, spiritual repose. And while that's lovely, it does a great disservice to the world that so desperately needs the influence of Christ and his message, doesn't it? There is, of course, another extreme in which God's people can become so absorbed in the world that it becomes indistinguishable from it. We have to always ask ourselves, where are we as God's people in that dynamic balance? Are we as a church at a point where we have become, by the ethics we have embraced, by the message we proclaim, virtually indistinguishable from the world? Are we simply parroting what is fashionable in the culture? Can somebody go to DSHS and hear basically the same thing they hear in church? If that's the case, we're in trouble. On the other hand, have we so distanced ourselves from the world that anything we say is lost except on ourselves, as we, as the old saying goes, hold hands and share precious verses, you see? Where are we in that delicate balance? John Knox, I think, and he's not perfect, and we're going to see some of the imperfections of him before we're done. I want to be balanced in my treatment, but he's one of my heroes because he is a guy who, in my opinion, thrust himself into the middle of the thorniest, most difficult issues of his day, and yet never, to anybody's, at least perception, compromised the depth of his integrity and his commitment to the authority of Christ and the authority of His Word. And it made him a force to be reckoned with, and we are still feeling the effects of that force to this day. And I tell you, any one of us in this room can be, and indeed is called, to a similar kind of vocation. It may not be as famous. We may not have people talking about us 500 years from now. Probably won't. But every one of us in this room is in this world, and every one of us in this room is figuring out a way how we can be in it and not of it, and figure out how do we strike that balance. We're there, we have a message, we have a calling, we have a responsibility, and we at the same time have this duty before God to not let ourselves compromise at the point that is so deeply important to who we are as God's people.